made with bottle caps. But then it also turned kind of a new economic development leaf in that they now have a business and an artisanship which they can bring to throughout the region. So, okay, one point that he did for that. Again, you start dressing like you're building, that's pretty proud. And so he also tried to get the students involved in some other projects, going beyond the idea of what the building was, but what can a play structure look like? And so they kind of really took advantage of what are all the assets that they have around. And there's so many things that we don't see, in some communities that others see as huge, that hold huge value. And so he did a lot of cultural asset mapping, which enabled people to identify what things could be that might not be seen as useful, like this boat here. So he ran, again, a workshop with the kids. He ran a crowdsource fundraising effort to get them to move the boat, reconstruct it, and turn it into a play structure. And again, you can see the bottle cap effort behind as well. So, really fun at every level of the way. That's him jumping, just really got into it. He lived with community members down there for a year. And he's from Spain, I should say. And then also these benches were made from recycled material and construction debris that the kids built themselves. And the bottles from the bottle caps were used for a Christmas celebration. So really just trying to think of how can we get people involved in every aspect of the project. And this was one of the first that I had seen that was really driven by the community's needs and kind of asking folks what they wanted. And then a beautiful outcome as well that people really love. And so, this was kind of the first notion that I got in seeing that when people participate in the design of their own spaces, they're really going to sustain them. They're going to love them. And that's really kind of the true heart of sustainability. A lot of these other things are just additive. The second project I'm going to talk about is a disaster response project, but it was when a chapter was spun up just for responding to one disaster with one village. And this was in Karachi, Pakistan in 2011 when there was incredible flooding like there is unfortunately right now. But this was a group run by Mahbub Khan, and she mobilized her firm, which was more of a technical practice and engineering practice, to rebuild one village. And so what they did was, they just kind of employed very traditional methods, but with kind of flood-resistant and seismic retrofit so that it would actually stay up. The wonderful thing about this story isn't necessarily the outcome of the kind of physical design, but the process by which it happened. They asked women to get involved in the process where traditionally women were not invited into the process of redesigning their own towns. And they asked them, would you like bathrooms in your homes? Which seemed like a pretty simple ask. They said yes. They came back and said it was incredibly helpful because now the rate of UTIs has gone down dramatically because the bathrooms were so far away that at night there was no lighting. They were afraid to go out, or maybe, I don't necessarily know the situation, but it wasn't safe for them to go out. And so they would hold it and, get UTIs. And so now that just the simple fact that they were invited to tell their story of how they needed to change and have bathrooms in the structures, it improved the health of the community. This is the second aspect of it, in that they were able to advocate the property owners for women ownership of structures for the first time ever in this neighborhood, which is incredibly powerful because they were involved in the design process. They now were able to build equity and actually have power within the community as homeowners. And that's something that I found to be so incredible. I remember I was like sitting on a train when I got this email and just started crying. So those, and the outcome also had lights kind of for safer passage. And then the chapter dissolved. So it was up for just this project and acknowledged that they had to mobilize their entire firm. There were like 150 professional volunteers doing construction for a couple months, and they did a huge fundraising effort. So then they just kind of closed down the chapter and acknowledged this is the project that we're going to do. Great, done. I'm not going to go too much into my time at Code for America, but I will say that if you really want to impact the architectural profession, leave it. See something else. Because it is I leave it and then come back. But to see how another industry is run, the amount that I learned from governance, from the technology industry, from folks that are in government who actually want to do really good work but are struggling to try and do so because of bureaucratic processes, was so enlightening. And I'm trying to take some of those practices of kind of lean and iterative development, of lightweight kind of prototyping to architecture and design. And I know tactical urbanism has done a lot of that, and there's a lot happening in the design field, but in a way that is really kind of user-driven and tested in a lightweight way. I don't see much of in the design field. So I also got a lot of opportunity to facilitate government staff members in innovation and innovative practice, and to see how much just getting people in a room would change their mentality of a challenge, because there's incredible silos in government, and just to see those starting to break down is incredible. And just the idea of design is nowhere in people's minds. So seeing the uphill battle that we have to show that there is a need for this is something that I wasn't even aware of, even when I was working at Architecture for Humanity. So one big lesson that I learned from being at Architecture for Humanity was ask for help if you're in trouble. Admit when you don't have all of the resources or knowledge to solve a problem, and invite other people in, because the solution and that situation in and of itself might be pretty amazing. Again, focus on people's needs and really ask them and listen what their needs are, not your projected needs of them or your kind of conception of what could solve what you see without ever talking to someone. Because you'll build something and it'll be useless, which is what happens a lot in the tech industry. Unfortunately, in architecture, we don't have venture capitalists running to give us money. Don't compromise values for money, even if it's a large sum of money for one project. Make sure you understand what your base values are, what your base kind of principles are when you want to approach that project. Is community engagement a huge component of this project? But you have to be pressured by the marketing schedule of a large corporation. Don't take that funding. It is a lot, and the compromise will have drastic effects on projects that are slated to be community driven. Okay, next part, beyond intentions. So I've worked with a lot of incredible volunteers over the years, but we kind of have to move a little bit beyond raising our hands. And this is a lot of the challenging aspects of kind of what I've learned while working with volunteers, is that just because someone has a lot of passion and a lot of energy and maybe some time doesn't mean they're necessarily equipped to do this work. So have you guys all seen this quote or heard of Whitney Young's approach to the AIA? Hands? Oh, wow, okay. So there's a new one. So in 1968, Whitney Young, civil rights leader and architect, addressed the AIA and called them famous for its silence and irrelevance in terms of civil rights. So this was a huge, serious call out, kind of slap in the face. What this did was it started a community design center movement across the country, where you started to get a lot of architects doing community-based practice. And I think at one point there were 70 or 80, 90, maybe even 150 community design centers around. Now there's a little bit of a handful, because funding has gotten pretty difficult and scarce. And then, of course, Architecture for Humanity and their rally cry of design like you give a damn really, for the first time, opened it up to kind of new channels of discussion, what the potential of architecture could be. And they really showed what was possible by doing large structures all over the world. And they grew a huge network. There were, I think by the time it closed, like 200,000 people on their email list and tons of social media followers. But maybe that happened a little too quick, and maybe without enough infrastructure to support it. And so when we started our efforts after I got that phone call from the last executive director of Architecture for Humanity saying that they were closing and filing for bankruptcy, I was like, well, there's all these people still doing work. They're not getting paid for it. So are you going to tell them? And they didn't really have a plan. I had still kind of stayed on as advisor liaison between the chapters and the headquarters because I knew they were running a little lean and weren't going to replace the role. So we just kind of put a call out there. Of course, people remained and rallied. And so we put the practice that we use on the ground on ourselves. And we were like, okay, well, if we believe that when people participate in something that they'll actually sustain it and love it a little bit more, what about an organization? And so we tried as best we could to get everyone to participate, those who really wanted to see it moving forward, even when we had no idea what we were going to do, what the objective was, what we were going to call ourselves, or even just what happened to the money. We kept moving because we knew that this was important enough to have within the architectural profession. And so we just started organizing, and this was while I was working at Code for America in 2015. We just kind of all did it together. We got leadership groups up and running. We had a steering committee, and we eventually raised a little bit of funding to hire someone part-time. That's Alicia down there, to identify, how we could operate in the best way possible and to do some case study research. We were able to get together in person once in about April and decide that, yes, we have core values and we share them. And we should move forward with all of this in mind. So we had basic committees for governance and kind of all the other boring nonprofit or organizational things, which I'm not going to get into. But we could move forward because we had established shared values. And that was really basic. Make sure that everyone can participate. Really do your best to establish trust with whoever you're working with, and be open, be transparent. If you have problems, let other people know. They might come and help you. Don't be afraid of that. And so with that, we were really able to kind of push forward and eventually launch what is now the Open Architecture Collaborative. And a tagline that has just developed over the past couple of years of social design for social justice has kind of stuck over the past few months, but as everything else, it is iterative and it will evolve, and that's okay. But this was the first steering committee that got together in Detroit in April to really define the future path of the organization. And so because of all this work, we got an initial seed grant to operate, and I was able to work full-time last year on the organization and establishing ourselves. So what are some of the differences now is that we move mostly on a focus of projects to people, and that we will support the professional development of the members in the network and the chapters in the network to become independent organizations, whether in the States or abroad. And so culture change, we're not going to fly around and kind of figure out where we can do best work, but we're going to be proactively local. So understanding, kind of taking lessons from like what I learned in New Orleans, what are the systemic issues locally, and how can we just kind of research them, conduct outreach, build relationships, and start the conversation about addressing for real systems change. And so here's the mission statement, is that we're a global learning network to mobilize architects and designers for greater community impact. There are fast disasters, there are slow disasters. We work on the slow ones. And you can see by lots of the news happening right now that the fast disasters are usually indicators and symptoms of slow disasters. And there are reasons why these things happen. And so we're trying to work and focus on what's happening locally by building relationships with those who are most affected. And so what we do is we recruit, and now we're starting to build up trainings for professionals like yourselves to do and to build capacity within communities that are systemically excluded and marginalized from the civic processes of engagement, of investment, of decision-making. And so I'm going to give 3 examples now of chapter projects that I think are really doing great work. I'm going to talk about something in Bogota, Chicago, and then our pilot here in West Oakland. So Bogota, Taller del Habitat, Habitat Workshop, was an effort that came out of 10 years of practice in informal settlements in Bogota. So Ricardo Daza, he's the one up there. He's been working within different communities in Bogota for over 10 years, doing projects of all different types, kind of small builds, infill, helping people get new kitchens if they had a home business, doing kids' play centers, that's a daycare center and a library, or kind of standalone structures using whatever material they could find. And over the course of that 10 years, they really identified a process of how the building industry works in marginalized communities in Bogota. And that is that there's kind of materials. You have the producer, the seller, and then there's lots of resellers, and everything gets broken down, and people can afford to purchase small amounts of material whenever they have money, and they just kind of sits aside and waits until they have enough to build. But that means that a lot of materials are susceptible to rain and the elements, and so you're just kind of constantly getting kind of cut at every time you buy materials. But what people don't always have access to are, one, the architects, the financing to get land rights, the financing to get loans for materials, or the legal support to get tenure to the land. So again, people are building and not owning the land, and then of course not building any equity. And so what they've done is effectively, because they've experimented with all this different types of housing and gotten to learn and know community members and product producers, they've kind of bundled services together so that people can then afford design. So they're going out and doing a huge outreach campaign. They've created tons of outreach material, and so that people are effectively getting loans, getting access to legal services, and getting access to a designer and materials so that they can build. And so they're doing lots of small-scale projects that are kind of converting people's homes into stores and allowing them to actually make their own livings. And so this is after 10 years of just experimenting with how to work. Did they come up with this model for operating? They got an initial grant to operate it. They have about 4 staff members, and we'll see if it becomes financially sustainable. We don't know. It's been running for about 6 months now. I hope it does. I think it's an incredible model for operating. And the second project that I like to talk about is the Altgeld Garden projects on the south side of Chicago. This is the Chicago chapter, started when it was called Architecture for Humanity, and mostly partnered with an organization called People for Community Recovery, which is an amazing environmental justice organization that was started in the 70s when Hazel Johnson realized that so many of her friends were just dying of cancer. It's because there is a cancer donut, which is kind of in the south side of Chicago on the border of Indiana. And that red dot is where Altgeld Gardens is as a housing community. And so what they did was they just organized and built a lot of capacity to kind of push for rights for land reclamation, for fixing a lot of the asbestos and materials in people's homes that were causing a lot of illness. And so what they did was they responded and put a lot of pressure when the Chicago Housing Authority wanted to demolish every home in their neighborhood. And they said, wait, we've been here for 3 generations. This is our home. We have lots of amenities. So we don't want you to demolish all our homes. And so they got the Chicago Housing Authority to push back as a coalition of organizations locally. And at that point, the Chicago Housing Authority was like, okay, well, fine, we'll assign you a planner and an architect. And they were like, we're going to get our own, thanks. And we'll just compare notes afterwards. And so they brought on the Chicago chapter, who led a lot of community outreach engagement meetings in many different forms. You saw in that first slide. They operated in the open. They put just plans on buildings and engaged people as they walk by. They went where people were instead of trying to ask people to come to a meeting when they couldn't. And they did a huge effort in getting people's quotes and really trying to identify what the assets were within the community. Not only that, but they created an entire plan of, kind of what were the pathways that were being blocked and what would be ideal layout so that you could get to your friends' homes. So what they did an incredible planning effort to understand who needed to get involved when. They did power mapping to understand kind of the different aspects of how to make things happen, and they built that capacity together with all the community groups that were involved. And so this is Cheryl Johnson, Hazel Johnson's daughter, who now runs the People for Community Recovery. And because of that effort, they saved 97% of their homes and started reclamation processes that will give local people jobs in making their homes healthier. And so this is just kind of an effort where the architects and the organization came to support something that was already being led within a community. And together, they achieved something that was pretty remarkable. The last project I'm going to talk about is just done locally. This is a pilot that we have